Good evening, everyone. We welcome you to JTS and to this lecture. My name is Rabbi Gordon Tucker. I'm Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement here at JTS, and we want to welcome everyone to this, the annual Bernard G. Segal Memorial Lecture in Law and Ethics. This year is really special because the lecture not only stands on its own, as it always does, but it has found its way to be folded into a larger convening that's happening yet today and tomorrow on anti-Semitism and allyship. And the title of this lecture, as you no doubt know, is Antisemitism and Free Speech on Campus. Just, 2 or 3 sentences about why we think this is particularly important in general, but particularly here at JTS. It's always an interesting confrontation when there's, right versus wrong, and you hope you come out on the correct side with that. But the really difficult things are when there's a right on one side and a right on the other. And that's sort of the case here. I mean, we feel certainly as Jews that we have a right, as any group does, certainly any minority group has a right not to be harassed and a right to have freedom from harassment. We also feel very strongly as heirs to a Talmudic tradition of, let it all hang out and debate, of the importance of free speech, as a value for us and as a value for us not only as Jews but as Jews in a democratic society. So how these two can live side by side, or as the rabbis like to say, how can you reconcile these two verses, which both seem to be correct and yet are in tension with one another, is the very important topic for tonight. I should add that, particularly here at JTS, not everyone knows this, our largest school of the 5 schools we have under our aegis is the Albert List College of Jewish Studies, which our Chancellor, Shuli Rubin Schwartz, was the dean of some years back, and has a special affection for it, as do I, and so many of us here. All of those students are doing additional degree programs, either as a dual degree or as a double degree with Columbia and or Barnard. And so our own students are being exposed to some of these very difficult right versus right issues on their campuses, and it's something that important for us to be caring for. So we do welcome you especially for this very, very timely evening with 2 wonderful speakers who will be introduced to you in just a moment by our moderator, to whom I now turn it over, my colleague, Rabbi Julia Andelman.
There's a big height differential here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program. And I want to extend a special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time tonight, and invite everyone, whether first time or not, to silence your cell phone. This annual lecture was established by JTS in honor of the late Bernard G. Segal, who was a skilled corporate lawyer who argued nearly 50 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, a groundbreaking leader in legal policy nationwide, the first Jewish president of the American Bar Association, and a philanthropist and leader in the Jewish community. In addition to his longtime career with the firm of Schneider, Harrison, Segal, and Lewis, he carried out an array of special assignments for Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, chairing and often founding national committees that took on causes such as expanding the role of the organized bar in the selection of Supreme Court justices, marshaling attorneys to fight segregation and race-based discrimination and to support civil rights legislation and public policy, and enlisting lawyers throughout the nation to provide legal services to the indigent. Segal was recognized by legal luminaries for his, quote, indefatigable efforts to expand and improve legal services for the poor, the powerless, and the dispossessed. and, quote, his mighty role in pushing the organized bar and many individual lawyers to accept the eradication of racial discrimination and religious bigotry as part of their mission. He received awards and honors from numerous institutions, including an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from JTS, and supported critical Jewish organizations such as the Jewish Publication Society, the Philadelphia Allied Jewish Appeal, and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where the law library is named for him. In the words of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Bernie represents the highest and best ideals of the legal profession. We are so pleased to be joined tonight by two of Bernard Segal's grandchildren, Mark Cohen and Jennifer Cohen, and by his former law partner, Bruce Rosenfield. And we're very grateful to you, Bruce, for helping to bring this program to fruition. So I'll just add a word about the what led us to organize this program tonight. In the aftermath of the horrific events of October 7th and the ensuing war, issues of anti-Semitism and free speech have roiled college campuses with far-reaching implications for the Jewish community, the role of higher education in American society, and democracy itself. Tonight's program, as Rabbi Tucker said, explores the vitally important question of how institutions of higher education can preserve the right of free expression while simultaneously combating anti-Semitic harassment and ensuring that Jewish students, faculty, and staff feel safe and supported. As all of you know, much of the public discourse around these issues has been combative, unnuanced, not only unproductive, but often counterproductive. We are so honored and privileged tonight to be joined by two professors who serve both as thought leaders and also as heroes in the trenches on their respective university campuses, who are going to lead us in a much more complex consideration of the challenges of this moment and all that is at stake. And I'm so honored to introduce them now. Dr. Segal Ben-Porat is MRMJJ Presidential Professor of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also a member of the Philosophy and Political Science departments and faculty director of the SNF Paideia Program for Civil Dialogue. Among her recent books, the title make obvious why she's here tonight, are Cancel Wars, How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy, and Free Speech on Campus. She's a member of Penn's Commission to Address Hate, and she previously chaired Penn's Committee on Open Expression. Over the past decade, she's been offering guidance to colleges and universities on policy development and other responses to controversies surrounding speech. A native of Israel, she received her doctorate in political philosophy from Tel Aviv University. Professor David Shizer is Dean Emeritus and Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School. He currently serves as co-chair of Columbia University's new task force on antisemitism. He is a co-founder and co-chair of the Center for Israeli Legal Studies at Columbia Law School, and he served as dean of the law school for 10 years, from 2004 to 2014. He has also served as CEO of the American Joint Distribution Committee, a global Jewish humanitarian organization. He clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and for Judge Alex Kozinski on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And he's the author of How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits. And we are happy to be giving out complimentary copies of the book this evening. They'll be available courtesy of the Columbia Center for Israeli Legal Studies after the program. So after we hear from first Dr. Ben-Porat and then Dean Emeritus Professor Shizer, I will conduct a conversation with our panelists, followed by questions from you. And I'm so pleased to invite Dr. Ben-Porat to the podium to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you, Rabbi Endelman, and thank you, Rabbi Tucker, and my appreciation to Tom and to everyone who made this visit possible. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of the Segal lecture. Beyond all the other wonderful things you've heard about Bernard Segal, he also has a long-term connection to Penn and the Penn Carey Law School, and it's really an honor to speak at a lecture that carries his name, so thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to speaking at JTS and that you all can share the evening with us on this beautiful partial eclipse day. The protests on Penn's campus started October 9th, and part of them were vile. I flew to Israel in late October and again in December and again last month to support my parents, who were earlier among the founders of Nachal Oz, and to be with my brother, who I'm so happy to have here with me today, visiting from Israel, and my other family and friends. Whenever I'm there, many people ask me about the struggles on campuses here. It is front page news for weeks on end. And still, every time that I make the trip from Israel back here, I'm struck by the lack of nuance and understanding in many of the debates on campus. The privilege of the unaffected is sometimes jarring, especially when traveling from a region in active war with all its profound mourning and fear to what sometimes feels like performative expressions of pre-existing ideologies. Many faculty and students project their ideologies on this conflict and know, without knowing too much, where they stand. How low are the stakes for many campus activists, and how high they are for everyone in our region and for many people in this room. My work since and my talk today are part of my effort to explore possibilities for our campuses to serve as thought leaders rather than be dragged into this ideological fight, as well as our community's role in promoting this possibility. On American campuses, I observe a shift since October 7th in rhetoric and expression about the conflict, about Israel, and about Jews. This shift is expressed in some of the extreme rhetoric we hear on campus and in the broader engagement by many who were previously uninterested in the topic and have become involved. And I have to say, on various sides of it, I see it from both people who, from people who participate on protests and other events on both sides of the campus debate. The chants and calls on the pro-Palestinian sides have been with us for a long time, but they have become more frequent and louder in the fall, and for many of us, they have taken a more menacing meaning, especially because, in some cases, they were justifying the massacre. In addition, in protests and marches by the pro-Palestinian side, we are seeing efforts to single out Jewish business owners and public figures and call for condemnation of them or boycotting their businesses and sometimes damaging their businesses, just last week in my neighborhood, based on perceived or actual support that they have voiced for Israel. This is not entirely new, but seems to have increased in the fall, as I mentioned, and is now, it ebbs and flows. While on many or most college campuses, our actual safety as Jews is not threatened, our sense of safety is diminished in many places. These are all shifts from the world we knew as we knew it until October 6. Many of these forms of expression, political, hate-based, and the gray area between them, existed back then, but are now more frequent and more extreme. On campus, we see them in classrooms, where various areas of study, so beyond the protests, right, they also exist in classrooms, where areas like ethnic studies, as well as some professional schools like social work and some disciplines like anthropology, have focused undue attention for years on singling out and vilifying Israel and sometimes Jews by association. As my colleague Josh Teplitsky, who is the chair of the Jewish Studies at Penn, reminds me, throughout history, Jews are other enough, have been other enough to be useful symbols for all that ails the world, whether it's going to be Bolshevism or colonialism or capitalism or fascism. It's easy to single out the Jews and blame them for these ills, or for whether, if you perceive any of these as ills, of course. We are seeing examples across various campuses of such instances. For example, in San Diego State, there is an incident with a Chicano studies class where the instructor started the term with a lecture about colonialism and apartheid in Israel, which was both uninformed and unrelated to class material. Consider, for example, right nearby here, the recent struggle at Barnard over the landing page of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. The program posted a pro-Palestinian statement on its front page shortly after October 7th. The administration took it down, and the free speech tussle ensued. Who owns the front page of the program? Who gets to speak through it? For whom do they speak? Do they speak for the program's faculty, all of them or some of them? Do they speak for the students, for the college? This is familiar territory, at least for me as a scholar of campus expression, although I do want to emphasize I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a philosopher by training, and so my work is in philosophy and education, as you heard from Julia, but I do want to emphasize that. But this territory of who owns the landing page, right, has a new twist based on the notion that support for Palestinian causes is, it is suggested by this argument, part of the mission of the Gender and Sexuality program. Although there are definitely gendered aspects to the conflict or the occupation or whatever topic people may want to discuss in this regard, to suggest that if you're interested in studying women, gender, and sexuality in New York City, you have to care about this particular sliver of land and its struggles, and that you have to take sides in this conflict. You have to take one side in this conflict. If you are a student of gender in at Barnard in New York, that is questionable for me, and I think we need to consider whether it's reasonable. Students who come for studying gender and end up endorsing an uninformed perspective on Israel-Palestine deserve our attention, and they are the people I worry about most, whether they are Jewish or not. They learn ideology and political views rather than disciplinary methodological approaches, and they get a limited and possibly anti-Semitic understanding of a complex issue. My critique here is not about specific arguments that are raised by this statement or by anyone who's talking about the war or criticizing Israeli policies, but about the ways and domains in which they are raised on campus. I see the spread of these concerns and the focus on Israel in such unexpected quarters as a consequence of American political polarization, where increasingly, to prove your bona fides as a proper progressive, you have to align with the Palestinian cause, even without knowing much about it, and that's a concern to me. The demand for ideological purity within our distinct political camps, the call to align yourself as a young, or sometimes not young, person with your ideological camp or be an outcast, is a result of the distance created by polarization between the two political camps, right? So it's a long-term process that we are seeing being extended and escalated by the conflict. If we used to have broadly two ideological camps, Democratic and Republican, or conservative and progressive, and they had some overlap in between them, increasingly, as a matter of American politics, we are seeing two faraway camps with a scorched earth in between. And this is a problem for democracy more broadly. I hope I don't need to remind you that there's an election coming up. And it's also a problem for the ways in which the conflict in Israel and Palestine is being discussed and addressed. So I want to move to the part of my talk where I discuss what it is that can be done about all of this. And I want to first just put aside a few things that should not be done, and then definitely offer some ideas about what should. So I want to put aside the question about how to respond to acts that are already illegal. Harassment, illegal, right? Vandalism, illegal. They are beyond the topics that I want to discuss here because they require law enforcement intervention, and I think that's merited. We remain with the question of what to do with speech or speech-related actions like protests that are misguided and potentially anti-Semitic, but are still protected by the First Amendment. This is the First Amendment, other case law, Title VI, etc. And I want to clearly differentiate my recommended responses from some of the suggestions promoted by others who raise similar concerns. I don't think censorship is the answer because I support speech laws and academic freedoms, rules and practices which are central to a functioning democracy. I don't think undue pressure by outside forces will do the work here because universities cannot do their work without appropriate levels of autonomy, as I've argued extensively in the past and I still believe. And I don't think we can use laws like the discriminatory concepts or the divisive concepts that are circulated around about a dozen or maybe 15 primarily red states are going to do the work for us either. I really think we cannot punish our way out of this, although I do think appropriate processes which would limit hateful, persistent, and targeted and exclusionary speech in some cases definitely merit punishment as well. So what can be done? I have recommended, so I've pared it down because I only just have a few more minutes left. I have recommendations for campus leaders, for faculty, for students, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. But really what I want to talk to you all about today is within this community of scholars and parents and grandparents, grandchildren, and other Jewish community members, what can we do about what is happening on university campuses today? We should focus, I think, our demands on leaders of these campuses taking a stand, but we should not focus on them making the perfect statements. The perfect statement is not going to come. It doesn't exist, and it's also not going to help us. I really don't think this is where our attention needs to go. I think we should focus most of our attention on the core mission of the university, namely teaching and the cultivation of knowledge. And we should support ways that are tied to the core mission of the university that would help us address this long arc of difficult, problematic, potentially anti-Semitic ways of thinking about Israel and about Jews over the years, and its culmination in the current conditions post-October 7th. And we need to support the university in addressing those. For example, we should support the study of hate and effective responses to it. We should provide alternatives to the inaccurate and hateful portrayals of Israel and of Jews and of hate-based violence and expression. So, for example, at the University of Michigan and recently at NYU as well, they started new centers for the study of and prevention of antisemitism. Other campuses are sponsoring, like you all are, speaker series, supporting departments in hiring or cultivating their work on Jews, on Israel, as we just heard in regards to David's Center, and similar topics, and otherwise responding to this crisis in a way that aligns with their strength, working to produce and disseminate accurate knowledge. This is important work that should be demanded, and it should serve as an antidote to some of the flat, inaccurate, and mystical depiction of Israel and Jews as conspiring to promote capitalism through colonialism and similar arguments, Israel is the only example of colonialism in our time, uniquely powerful, uniquely evil, uniquely not meriting a right to exist as an independent state. All of these, for me, are versions of anti-Semitic visions of past eras. And I just want to make sure that I'm clear. As a Zionist Jew, I support the continued existence of my country and its right of self-determination. And as an Israeli citizen, but not only just as an Israeli citizen, I maintain my right to criticize my government. This simple nuance is lost on many debates on American campuses. I don't need to agree with everything that the Israeli government does in order to support its right to exist. And I don't think that's unique to me as an Israeli citizen. The use of the term Zionism as a word that carries condemnation is hateful rather than simply political, and associating being Jewish or being the wrong kind of Jew, as one of my colleagues at Penn says, with a particular political stance is an anti-Semitic position, and as such, it deserves rebuke. It leads to statements like the following, recently made by SJP. Let me be clear, I'm quoting, just as Israel, in quotation mark, has no right to exist, Zionism has no right to be on campus. This is inappropriate, right? And we should not be tolerating that as a matter of course on our campuses. Again, it doesn't mean that we need to simply censor it or expel or fire anyone who says that, but it deserves a response. And I really worry about students who are either saying that or hearing that and hearing no response to these statements from their campus. Our core commitment as a university is and needs to remain tied to the effort to seek truth and to educate all of our students in the values of diverse democracy. So, for example, and we should insist on including Jews in our ethnic and ideological diversity in all the structures and practices that are focused on belonging and inclusion. So, for example, on my campus, Penn, where these struggles spill onto the streets and the halls of Congress, culminating in the resignation of sorts of Penn's president, 2 committees were formed in response to the turmoil. First, a task force to address antisemitism. One of its members is with us tonight. And second, a commission to address hate and build community. The unintended but still clear message here is the wrong one. Antisemitism is one thing, and hatred is a different thing, right? We need to fix them separately. It's the wrong message, and it not only represents a singling out of Jews, it also is unproductive and can readily lead to a backlash. And I worry about this every day because I work on the commission every day. It's a lot of work. This is partly a result of demands coming from Jewish alums and donors who were, at least in part, concerned rightly about the safety of Jewish students. But as a community, again, we should avoid undue pressures on universities because they subvert the work of the institution and they end up leading us down paths that are improper and unhelpful. We can and should communicate our personal and, where relevant, communal expectations in a clear way. We can demand that universities clearly define and enforce the rules on harassment, on protests, on banners, discrimination, and other matters of concern that we observed this past few months. And in some cases, way before that, you will hear more from David on that, I suspect, because his campus and his commission is a few steps ahead of us. In a democracy, open expression is protected because we want to ensure that each of us can express their views and therefore maintain both their dignity and the knowledge of their fallibility. On campus, protecting free speech is needed also, beyond that, to ensure that we can listen to each other, as the Chancellor said earlier today, and I strongly agree, that we can learn from each other, that we can engage in shared discussion. It's not only enough that you can speak, it's also central that I can hear you and that we can have an exchange. This is what matters on campus, and this is what our rules should reflect. We do that in order to express our shared commitment to correcting our mistakes and to advance truth in the repository of knowledge available to all. And the disciplines can help us with that, and serious study can help us with that. And therefore, the mission of an institution may both ground requirements for protecting free expression and also justify constraints on misrepresentations, on lies, on hurtful expression, and on speech that breaks professional norms. So I think we need to find our way to marry both of them rather than choose one or the other. And I will just note, in terms of recommendation, one last thing that I would say that as a community we could do is we can stay away from campuses where these demands are not being properly addressed, where we do not feel safe and supported, each of us by our own account, and we should support and attend other campuses. And I know that I'm saying that we are ceding ground and leaving spaces where we should belong. I can hear myself saying that. But I also work with some campuses where I personally would not, at this moment, send my children. So I just want to say that it can, and it's a handful of campuses. It's not half the campus. There are 4,000 colleges and universities in the US. If there are 5 that you shouldn't use for 2 or 3 years until they get their act together, I think I'm not gonna go there. So that's my perspective, and I recognize that it's controversial. At their best, universities provide opportunities for people to meet diverse others and learn together, which allows them to see the value of thinking through differences, not necessarily in order to change their mind, although that can happen, but primarily for understanding my own opinion through hearing yours and the process of explaining mine, and also understanding my neighbors, my compatriots, and other human beings with whom I need to learn and share resources, decisions, and institutions. The rethreading of the civic and political fabric has to occur within the context of an institution where we meet one another and we meet others who are different from us along various lines, where we engage in a shared effort to understand the world. We should use this difficult period of time to call on universities to do more to include our community in this shared effort as equals. Thank you.
So I'm a little tempted to just say I agree and sit down. But if I did, I would certainly miss the opportunity I refuse to miss to say what an absolute privilege it is to be here at JTS, which is a simply magnificent institution, so important to the future of the Jewish world, to the future of the world. And every time that I'm here, it just reconfirms what I know, which is what a treasure this place is. So thank you all for building and maintaining such a great place. Thank you also for inviting Segal. Segal, that was so scintillating and inspiring and interesting, and of course it doesn't surprise me. I know your work. I will just explain to all of you how my remarks will differ from Segal's. I think I'm going to focus more on the legal issues, and you may see some differences between us, but I do want to say I think Segal's diagnosis of the intellectual currents that have brought us here are spot on, and we can talk more about that. And I also think that first and before everything else, universities have to remember that we're schools, and so teaching the right way is foundational, and so we can talk more about that. But I use the word foundational for a reason, because I also think that the word foundation reminds us that that intellectual mission can't happen and it can't be effective without preconditions that need to be guaranteed and protected. And I do think that a big part of that are having the right rules about free expression and what they mean. And so I think I'm going to dig a little deeper there today, just because I think it's very topical. And of course, this is partly what Mr. Segal gathered us here to do, and I'm very grateful to be part of that conversation. But maybe what I'll do is I'll start with how I ended up being drafted to be on this task force, because I can't say that it has been the most fun experience of my life, but it has been incredibly meaningful. And it has been meaningful partly because of the horrors of October 7th and the desire we all have to do at least something, even if it's small, to contribute to what the world needs. But I will also say that my heart goes out and stays with students at Columbia and at places like it. And I just want to give you a bit of a flavor of what they've been facing. And the truth is, I say this because it's not visible to faculty like me unless we actually look. And once I do that, then I'll talk a bit about the legal issues and what I think needs to be done at Columbia, at other places like it. But I will tell you that I have a wonderful student. He was in my federal income tax class in the fall, and he left class, and he was out in the hallway, and he wears a kippah. And someone came up to him and said, "F the Jews." Didn't know him, just saw he was wearing a kippah, said this. By the way, not a Columbia law student, but a Columbia student from another school. Horrible. Another student at the law school went to witness and film a pro-Palestinian protest, and people saw him wearing a kippah, and so they spit on him at Columbia. We have still another student, an undergraduate, someone I haven't met, but I know the story. He was wearing a t-shirt with an Israeli flag on it. He had been watching a protest. He left the protest. Some people basically surrounded him, pushed him up against a wall for the crime of wearing this t-shirt with an Israeli flag. He eventually squirmed out of that hold, and they said, "Keep effing running." At a university, right? At my university. We have stereotyping going on. If you say that you're unsafe around Israeli veterans, let's all remember that most people in the state of Israel are drafted. They have to serve, which is another way of saying that we can't be around Israelis. Now that is, in my judgment as a lawyer, quintessential discrimination based on national origin under a rule called Title VI, and I'm coming back there. Last thing that I'll highlight is that, unfortunately, and this is the least visible, but in ways the most troubling to me, and I want to emphasize this is not Columbia alone. This is true at a lot of institutions. There's a lot of social exclusion going on. You may have seen a story in The Atlantic about Stanford where some geniuses decided to have a party where in order to get in, you had to either say Free Palestine or F Israel. I think there's a number of people who would refuse to do that, and apparently they can't go to the party. The Stanford administration was quoted saying they couldn't confirm whether this happened, but the university's anti-discrimination rules certainly do apply to student parties, and they do, right? But I know a law student who was very excited to be in a program that our students run, where they go and they represent New York City public school kids who've been suspended. So you need a lawyer in a hearing. Our law students will go and do that. But then this group decided to join a pretty extreme statement put out in early October, attributing October 7th to Israel and Israel's flaws. So a couple of our students at the law school decided they couldn't be in this group anymore. Now, I would just ask you, does it make sense to have a litmus test about Israel in order to be able to represent students in New York City public schools? So this is wrong and I think actually illegal, and we can talk about that. But I do want to emphasize, because of the misimpression that what I've said could give you, this is not Columbia as a whole. This is sort of a small group of faculty who are passionate about a cause, and I understand why, but they're going about it the wrong way, in my opinion. And then student sentiment, which is not by any means dominant either, but they're pretty loud. But I want to just give you a counterexample that in October, the president of the law school's student senate, who is not Jewish, wonderful student of mine. His name's Justin Nwenu. And so he put out a statement for himself as president of the Student Senate, saying, among other things, just because he knew about the feelings of his Jewish colleagues, every single student in our law school deserves to feel safe and to know that they belong. So he put out a statement for Jewish students emphasizing that he was with them, and I think that the vast majority of faculty and students feel that way. So I don't want to overstate any of this, but at the same time, I do want to say that we have a problem at Columbia and at other places, and I'm happy to say the university is pretty vigorous in trying to deal with it. It's not easy. But let me now turn to some rules. And as a case study, I want to focus on the rules governing protests. And this is where our task force began. And for those of you who are craving more, you can look at the report that we put out about a month ago on this very subject, and I'm just going to give you some highlights from it. But we started there for a reason. When I speak to students, I am very clear on the fact that some protests, particularly protests in the hallway of an academic building, can feel really oppressive to people who were really troubled by what's being said. And I know of one student in another school, not the law school, who had to go back and forth from class, and she's the leader of the student pro-Israel group in her school. And the protesters knew that, and so when she'd go from class A to class B to class C, she was enduring taunts. They made fun of her, all the rest, and that's not part of what anyone signs up for, okay? So the point is the protests themselves were creating issues, and so the question is what to do. And so I want to then turn to the three principles that I think are really essential when we approach the question of how to manage protests at a university. And I want to start by really emphasizing something that Segal said. Free speech is essential, right? We shouldn't stop people from protesting. It is a right. It is part of what we do at universities, which is to encourage people to explore ideas, to follow the logic where it leads them. And so I am very much not a fan of censorship. And so when we talk about the three principles, the one I lead with is what I would call free speech rights. Free speech rights. I think censorship is wrong. And that's really the beginning and the end of it for me, but in case anyone wants to think a bit strategically on behalf of the Jewish community, I will mention also that I personally have no interest in being censored. I don't really want to empower leaders of any university to decide what I can say, and it wouldn't shock me if at some point people decide that my efforts to defend Israel might be problematic and that maybe I shouldn't do it. Right? So I don't think censorship is good in and of itself. I don't think it's good for the Jewish community. I'll just add, to the extent that a protest happens, that's one thing. To the extent that the Zionists silenced our voices, that's probably a bigger story. So I think free speech matters, and I think it comes first. But there are two other principles that I want to emphasize, which I think lead to a much different environment, a much better environment, combined with our efforts to protect free speech. So that brings me to principle number 2. Free speech responsibilities, right? It's not a one-way street, it's not a free lunch, pick your metaphor. So if I have a free speech right, and thankfully I do, it doesn't mean that I can shout down my friend Ari who's trying to speak or pull down his posters. This is a very well-established idea in First Amendment doctrine. You guys may know it. It's called the heckler's veto. And the First Amendment does not entitle you to shout down other people, because actually everybody has a free speech right, and we have to be very attentive to making sure that everyone can do that. And I actually think at a university, a particularly important thing to keep in mind is we're there to teach. And so although I may have the right to protest, I absolutely don't have the right to get in the way of a class, because there are other people who want to hear their professor. They pay a significant amount of money to be there. And so, again, my free speech rights are sacred, but they're also limited, and they can't get in the way of other people's free speech rights. And so that's principle number 2. Free speech rights, free speech responsibilities. And then the third point is anti-discrimination. It's also a core value of a university like Columbia that we want everyone to be welcome, to feel welcome, and we don't tolerate harassment and discrimination. And it is a matter of values, but frankly, it's also a matter of law. Because if you take money from the federal government, as almost all universities do, you're subject to a rule called Title VI, which doesn't allow a hostile learning or work environment, and it doesn't allow discriminatory harassment. And so that's the third principle, is anti-discrimination. And once you start implementing all three together, things change. And so let me just take you briefly through a couple of the recommendations that we as a task force have made. And I'll start with the first, which I'm very happy to say the university implemented even before our report came out. And that is an idea that we should absolutely have protests. There should be no test about your viewpoint or the subject. You're entitled. You can go protest about anything from any point of view, but you have to sign up for a designated location on campus. And when I first started talking about this, people said, "Are you going to send people to a warehouse in New Jersey?" And that was absolutely not what I had in mind, and fortunately it's not what the university did. It's a very central location. For those of you who know the rest of the campus, it's the South Lawn and the Sundial. It's the main area between Butler Library and Low Library, and it is a traditional place on campus where people protest. But the point is, you can't be in the lobby of an academic building. You can't be in a dorm. You can't be in a dining hall. You can't disrupt the functions of the university, but you absolutely can protest, and you can protest there. And people can sign up from noon to 6 o'clock. Just sign up 2 days in advance. It's available 5 days a week, Monday through Friday during the semester. And so that was the first thing that we thought was really important, and the university has done it, again, because it protects free speech rights of everyone. Another thing that was really important is we had to get enforcement right. And so the truth is there were changes in rules, and I just mentioned one that I thought would be important. But the rules that existed were pretty good. It's just that the university was struggling a bit in figuring out how to enforce them effectively. And just remember, we're a school. We're not designed to have a well-developed judicial system, but we needed something more robust. And I'll just give you a flavor of why this was hard. So when I was a dean years ago, my view about protests was if people want to come to my office, if they want to take over my office, they can come. I have another office, and that's fine. And the premise of that comment is that the cost of the protest, that the object of the protest is the administration, and the cost of the protest will fall on the administration. And guess what? We're big girls and boys, and we can take it. And so if you think about what you don't want at a protest, and at Columbia, minds go back to 1968, and then perhaps an overly vigorous response, and New York City police and injuries, and it was not anything that we want to repeat. And so I think the received wisdom was, wait them out, right? Wait them out because the costs fall on the administration, and we can take it. So that doesn't apply here, because here the cost of the protests fell on other students. And now all of a sudden, it's not appropriate to say, well, just wait them out, because what you're doing then, not intentionally, this was not the way people hadn't, I think, quite woken up to this yet, was that that kind of patient response left some students vulnerable to things that shouldn't be happening. And so we needed to ramp it up, and I'm happy to say that the university has in various ways, and you might have seen a statement from our president about some people being suspended, and I can talk about that. But I think the point is that we needed to reimagine a bit what enforcement looked like, again, while protecting everybody's right to speak, and this is not an effort to silence voices, it's just an effort to protect everyone's rights by channeling protests to the right place. Let me finish with some thoughts about anti-discrimination, because that's the third principle, and it is incredibly important as well. And I do think, and Segal said it, she just said it very briefly, some stuff is illegal, right? You can't have people saying F the Jews, right? This is textbook, and you can't have stereotyping. And the truth is that some calls to violence, explicit calls to violence about a protected class are problematic too. And so we need to be sure that everyone in the community understands that. And I'll just highlight another issue that our report points out, and I think we have persuaded a lot of people about this, but I'll just share it with all of you. Even-handed approaches and consistency are essential here. And so, for example, I think that for many years, places like Columbia have tended to defer to a protected class, and I'm sorry to use the legal jargon, but to a group protected by the civil rights laws, defer to them about what it is that is discriminatory and that causes them to feel pain and discomfort. And so that was the practice. And then come October 7th, Jewish students started making that point, and the reaction of some in our community was pretty different. Not like, oh, this causes you pain, we understand, we won't. But instead to focus, not on, like that's the way you hear it, but it's not the way it's intended, to shift focus to the speaker's intention and to the free speech rights of the speaker. Now, I will tell all of you, I personally am a free speech guy, and so I actually see a lot of merit in the idea that we should be more tolerant of letting people say things that are offensive. But that's a discussion one can have, and there are very compelling arguments on both sides about how much to focus on the audience and the effect on them, on one hand, and the speakers and their intent on the other. That's a hard question, but I'll tell you what's not a hard question. It has to be the same, right? You need a consistent practice for everyone. And I'm not saying that as a matter of opinion, although I do think that it's just. I'm just saying it's a matter of law. Under the anti-discrimination rules, it is a textbook problem to treat different protected classes differently. You simply can't do it. And so we've been emphasizing that as well. Because I'm having so much fun, I'll just share one other thought, which follows from that, which is a bit unexpected, but it's useful perhaps for you guys to understand it. What I just said about equal treatment for all protected classes also has another effect, and that is that it would be a legal mistake for a university, whether it's Columbia or another, to adopt a particular definition of antisemitism in its anti-discrimination rules. And let me be clear, there are other uses of them, and I'll just say a word about that. But when you're talking about what is not okay under anti-discrimination rules, you should not say, well, we're going to use the Jerusalem Declaration, IHRA, Nexus, or something else. And you might be saying, huh, why? And here's the reason. Because the relevant rule, the concept in the relevant rules is not anti-Semitism, it's discrimination, it's discriminatory harassment, it's hostile environment. Those are terms that apply to all protected classes. And if all of a sudden some clever university says, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have this definition for Jews, and we're going to have these definitions for other protected classes. Well, what you've done right there is you violated the civil rights law, just by having different definitions. You can't do it. So I was a bit annoyed at the New York Times. For those of you who saw this story, they completely got wrong the reason why we haven't yet talked about definitions, and it isn't because we're avoiding it. It's because we were writing about anti-discrimination rules, and there, can't use them. On the other hand, where are they really helpful? I think they're quite helpful in things like orientations, training materials, education, right? And there, it's perfectly appropriate to think about definitions, and so I have thoughts about that too. But to summarize, I do think that fundamentally, universities are about teaching and they're about research, and they're, at least to me, incredibly inspiring places. And that does need to be our focus. But in order for those missions to be successful, we need to ground them in the right rules in order to both to protect the rights of protesters and to protect the speech and learning rights of everybody else. And hopefully we're all going to get to that place. And I look forward to talking more about this. Thanks.
I want to thank both of you, not just for such thought-provoking and enlightening and clarifying presentations, but also for what you're doing. You know, most of us read an article, get worked up, you know, talk with someone who's directly affected, and then go on to our day jobs. But this is what you're doing all the time, and hearing, you know, thinking about the realities that have made your work necessary makes my heart feel heavy, and also my heart feels just full of gratitude to both of you for what you're doing. Thank you. Okay, before I ask you a few of my 200 questions, I want to explain to everyone how you can ask questions. You see the beautiful slide behind me. So we're, for the audience Q&A that we'll get to in a little bit, we are using a very simple, don't be scared, online platform called Mentimeter. So on the slide behind me, you can see how to log in on your smartphone. Just go to menti.com, menti.com, and enter the code on the screen, or you can even hold your phone up and scan the QR code. We're so 21st century at JTS. So feel free to submit questions at any point from now onward, and feel free to indicate if it's for a particular one of our panelists, and when we get to the Q&A, I'll select from among the questions that have been submitted, and we'll pose as many to our panelists as we have time for. And a personal request to aid me in curating and aggregating your questions. Please do two things. One, be concise, and two, be clear, like complete sentences. Thank you so much, because I'm reading a lot of them. All right. I wanted to ask you about faculty, the role of faculty. So Segal, you noted accurately, of course, that as much as we like to, you know, sort of use what's going on at universities and statements as like our headlines in the papers of record, actually universities and colleges are places of learning. And my question is, how do we deal with the fact that some of those charged with the teaching are, of course, part of the problem? I'm sure we can all think of examples, things that we've read in the news, and I'm really stuck on something that I haven't heard in the news, but that was shared with me personally by someone whose granddaughter is a student at a major university taking a class on the Native American experience. And the go-to reference point for genocide was Palestine. So what do we do with that? So I'd love to hear from both of you. And David, in your answer, one thing we talked about last week was that the task force at Columbia is comprised exclusively of faculty. So clearly faculty can be part of the solution, not the problem. So I'd love to hear thoughts from both of you.
Start.
Sure.
So I do think that there's a difference between what people do in the classroom on one hand and what they write in their research and what they say in the media on the other. And so to my mind, we want colleagues who take on difficult problems and explore different approaches to dealing with them. And I should be clear, I find the settler colonialist narrative to be completely unpersuasive, and we can talk about that. But putting that aside, I think the point is, my own personal goal in the classroom is that I really want students to see various aspects of a problem, and I feel like I'm at my best when they don't particularly know what I think. And I really like it when other colleagues take the same approach, because really we're there to expose people to possibilities so that they can choose for themselves. And I guess to be more blunt about it, I'm there to teach, I'm not there to indoctrinate. And I think that when we have that norm within a faculty, things work, even if we don't agree, and even if we very much disagree, it's fine, because each of us, when we're in that role of nurturing young minds, we're there to show them the different possibilities. Now, just to explain Columbia's choice to have a task force composed of faculty, I think the theory there is that faculty have a significant measure of influence, and then the question is, so who might be most persuasive in making the case to faculty? And the thought was, well, faculty probably would be. Now, don't get the wrong idea, we're not the only ones working on these issues. For example, the university's board of trustees, they're very involved. They're composed of donors and parents, and so there are lots of different perspectives that are contributing to the university's efforts here. But I do think faculty are important, and our job as a faculty task force is to listen to them and hopefully to make the case to them.
Yes, and I would add that while some of the most painful things that I heard from people on my campus after October 7th, especially immediately in the aftermath of October 7th, were said by faculty, my colleagues, right? Some of whom, are right across the hall from me. It's very hard. But I would say, and by the way, beyond their, these individuals' responses to October 7th, some public statements that they made during protests in front of students, for example, I don't need to know anything more. Right? That's not painful, but it's horrifying still. We were, it took us weeks more to count the dead, right? So what do you mean you don't need to know anything more? But I will say this, I remind myself regularly, it's a handful of faculty on a really large campus who I think really hold extreme positions about this topic that I think are misguided and potentially merit professional consequences if they go through the due process that we do have for concerns like this in regards to faculty. So I don't think faculty are beyond reproach. I've long taken heat for that because anti-Semitism and October 7th is not the first time that something like this happens on my campus. Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. So my view is, yes, you can have professional consequences for acting unprofessionally in your class, including acting in discriminatory ways towards your students based on their protected identity. And I think that's true about racism, and I think it's true about anti-Semitism, regardless of the definition, just like you said. I mean, it's true about, mistreating Jewish students because they are Jewish or singling them out. So I think the problem with specific handful of faculty who speak and act in hateful ways is, professional consequences potentially, based on due process. But more generally, we have to put more effort into offering significant, well-grounded alternatives of thought. We have to be thought leaders in regards to what we should say. We shouldn't say this. It's not well-grounded. I mean, not that it should be censored. It's just not very good teaching. Let's offer alternatives. And I think this is where my, the biggest promise of the campus lies.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about another group of stakeholders, which you just alluded to, which is boards and donors. And we saw a lot of action after the hearings in Congress with multiple heads of universities. Are we okay? Resigning, and significant factor there was donor pressure. There was also a lot of politics going on there, which maybe we leave aside now. But we may have folks in this room who, or we for sure have folks in this room who serve on boards of nonprofits and universities as well. What do you think is the right role of boards and donors?
That's your job, literally. So.
Okay. So I want to recommend a wonderful book that is sitting outside, complimentary copy.
I was going to do that. That was my contribution.
But I will tell you my thinking about the role of boards, because it's quite important and it is discussed there. So people serve on nonprofit boards because they care passionately about the cause, and that's absolutely appropriate. And there are a couple of mistakes that one can make. And one type of mistake is micromanaging and deciding that because you're passionate about about the cause, you should really weigh in about the cookies that are served in the break room and the color of the seats and so on. And really, that's not what you're supposed to do. But on the other hand, when it comes to issues like mission, litigation exposure, that's the board front and center. And the way I explain this in the book, and I'll share it with all of you, I bet, just looking around, that there are a number of people like myself who are parents of adult children. And this is not an easy thing, right? Because as parents, we would kind of like to express a view on everything. But we know that we shouldn't. And we know that if we do, it's counterproductive. But on the other hand, if it's important, and if heaven forbid our child is heading in a direction that we think is wrong or even dangerous, then we have to be loud and relentless. And I think that's what the right nonprofit board does, right? You empower the professional team to do what needs to be done. You support them, you check in with them, they have to be accountable to you. But when you see something really problematic, you gotta be loud about it and you've gotta stop it. And now just turning to this, I'll say something that's entirely obvious. Philanthropy is voluntary, right? Which means that we do this because we love the institution. And if we feel that the institution is letting us down, we can find other institutions that we love. And that's what happens too. And I'm not saying that donors should direct everything, because that would be a mistake and it isn't really something donors are set up to do. But on the other hand, if people are registering their view by saying, look, this year and maybe next year, keep me posted, but you can't count on me because I'm really unhappy with what I'm seeing, but I know you're going to turn it around. And by the way, if you've got ideas and you need funding for those ideas to turn it around, do let me know. I mean, that's the way the sector is supposed to work, in my opinion.
Nothing to add?
Yeah.
All right. We've questions pouring in, not surprisingly, so let me just ask you one more. I just wanted to ask you, that this work that you're doing takes a personal toll on both of you, I'm sure, as Jews, as Jewish leaders, Segal as an Israeli. And it's, I just wanted to ask you about the personal experience of being so in the weeds on this and so invested and so involved in so much nuance of really complicated issues, and just seeing and hearing public discourse that's superficial and full of misinformation, as you just told us about your report. I don't know, can you comment on that experience, or if there's sort of, was there a moment that just killed you, or if there's one thing you could change?
Well, The work of the commission takes about 10 hours a week for the year. So, and it's of course voluntary, like philanthropy. It's not, it's part of the, it's one part of the service I do for the university. So it's definitely a lot of work, and it's sometimes very depressing. I am hopeful that some of the discussions that we have across significant differences can lead to a better direction for the university, which really was significantly impacted by all of this, right? Our president was one of the ones who resigned, as well as the chair of the Board of Trustees. I will say that one of the other hats that I wear is being the faculty director of the SNF-Padilla program on Penn's campus, which is a program devoted to civic dialogue. And so I will say more hopefully that really it's some of the work that's being done by students that giving me the most hope are students who are trained in diverse approaches to speaking and listening across difference, and who take multiple classes in practicing their dialogue skills in various contexts. And these are political science students, but they are also engineering students and Wharton business students and nursing students. So they are really, and chemistry students, right? So these are people who practice participating in civic dialogue and hearing each other across difference through their coursework and other involvements. And I really observe them and get a sense that, it can be done. Universities can really do it, and we know how to do it, and we have to get to a point where we are able to act on it, where we are able to do it, and we need rules for that, and we need the rules to be enforced, and we need faculty to listen to it as well. But I really am hopeful that most of the students are ready for that and can take it on. So, while the commission's work can sometimes drag me down, this work is really hopeful for me.
So I agree with that, and I'll say that I was confident that there would be at least 3 costs in taking this on, and I was right. Mm-hmm. And one of them is time. This has become the most important use of my time every day since the beginning of November when I agreed to do this, so the time cost is there. The second thing I did worry about is that I predicted that the very worst things that would happen in a very large campus would find their way to me immediately. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. I think that I have become one of the people who knows a lot about things I wish I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And the third cost is that I predicted accurately that the work I do is going to anger some people. They don't like it. There's been all kinds of interesting observations about my colleagues on the task force. I think almost none of them have been true, but they've been colorful. It turns out, for example, that there's all kinds of speculation about how much the Zionist donors are paying us to do what we do. And Chancellor, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm perfectly prepared to contribute everything I've been paid. But don't spend it. It's nothing. So then the question is, why is it that I nevertheless feel good about doing this work? And it won't surprise you. One thing I want to say is there may be some Brooklyn Dodgers, Casey Stengel fans here. I'm a Brooklyn boy myself. And what he said about managing baseball teams continues to be true, including about the work I'm involved in. He said, the key to being a successful manager is to know that there are 4 people on the team who are going to hate you, whatever you do. And there are 5 people on the team who are going to love you, whatever you do. And the art of being an effective manager is to keep everybody else away from the people who hate you. And I do think we just have to understand that when we work on things that are important, can't please everyone, we mustn't even think that we ever would, but we have to do what's right, and we hope that we can be effective. Which brings me to the last reason why I feel good about this work, and it comes from my co-chair, Nick Lemon, my friend, who said at the very beginning, he said, there just are awful things happening in the world, and I'm heartbroken about October 7th, and I just can't get my head around it. And what can I do? And then he said to me, he said, and we actually can do something, and so shouldn't we? And the answer, of course, is yes.
Thank you. We've so many really wonderful questions from the audience, so thank you. And I apologize right now that we can't get to all of them. Not surprisingly, as you both predicted, there are a lot of questions around the question of avoiding going to schools where these issues are hot right now. So I'll just a few things that people asked, all under that same rubric, are what are the 5 schools? Could you see? Is there a way in which avoiding such schools could be thought of as divestment? Should I stop giving to my alma mater if I'm not happy with how these issues are being handled? And, most fundamentally, how should Jewish students applying both to college and graduate school think about these issues? And I think that you have different views on this, so I'd love to
Yeah, we
hear
do
from
have
both of you.
different views, right? So I'll just reiterate mine briefly, and please disagree with me, as I know you do, because we already talked about this. My sense is that I don't care for labels in terms of like divestment or other, terms. What I care about is to make sure that my children who are post-college both now, if I were to send them to grad school or were again in the position of sending them to college, I would not send them to a place where I thought they would not be safe, right? And I would think about safety as a parent, not in the way that I think about safety as a commission member, which is more limited. As a parent, I want my children to thrive in the college where they go. And I think parents can and have a responsibility to, and the students do too, to look at places with this question in mind. Is a Jewish student, especially a student who is willing to, or maybe regardless of what they're willing to identify themselves, are going to be identified as Jewish? People wearing a kippah, people wearing my children's names, etc. So my sense is that it makes sense to consider this as part of our overall package of considerations. And in my view, there are places that you might think of as inappropriate generally, but then you go and you talk to the Hillel person, or you talk to other Jewish groups and leaders on campus, or you find Jewish alum and current students, and they will tell you, oh yeah, we had this couple little protests and they made the newspaper, but in fact, we have a thriving Jewish life here and we don't really worry about that. So the sense that you would get from the media or even from social media is often gonna be exaggerated, right? You have to investigate and look at this question, and in my view, just as you said, David, and I agreed with you about, withholding your donation if the university is going in the wrong direction, and advising them that this is what you're doing and they should do better and you can help them. The same thing can happen with paying tuition at a college that fails to address properly concerns that are brought to them by Jewish students.
So I don't know that we disagree necessarily. because Lord knows our children
Mom, we
are
should
our...
disagree.
But I'm getting there.
Yeah.
I'm getting there. Look, the decisions we make for our children, our grandchildren, their education, there's nothing more important than that. But I guess my concern, and I just pick up on something you said, is that the judgment may be just wrong. And so I will say that I have a daughter at Columbia, I have a daughter at Harvard. I read what the media says about these places. And I don't want to mislead you and say that my daughters are unaware or unaffected by some of what you'd read about in the papers. But they're having a magnificent experience, each of them, because the education is amazing, because the people they get to know are incredible, because each has a wonderful Hillel. And so the point is, we absolutely have to make the right judgment for our children. But I think that the judgment that I would have made a couple of years ago is not necessarily any different than the judgment that I would make now. And I could tell you flat out about Harvard, about Columbia. I would send my kids there in an instant without any hesitation. And I have a son who's a sophomore at Ramaz, and he'll be looking ahead to applications, and this is all on our minds. That's not to say that things are perfect, but Jews have been a fundamental part of these various institutions for a long time. There are universities too. We have a right to expect that our environment will be, not that we go to a place where everyone agrees with us. That's not the way life is in a democracy, and it's okay. But you have a right to expect certain things, and universities can be held accountable to deliver them. And I think that can happen. So my last point about donors is just do keep in mind that I said temporary reduction for a reason, because when you step away, you lose your voice. And I think that that's got a cost too. So again, I say, these are our places. Let's persist in pushing them to be better.
Yeah. Thank you. Aggregating a handful of questions here, I think some people would like to pin you down on some of the difficult cases that we've seen in the news over the last several months. So you can pick one. For example, suspending SJP, or one person asked about Columbia's Israel Apartheid Week, or the website that you mentioned, or a faculty statement made outside the classroom or in the classroom that's problematic. Kind of, can you pick a case each and say, here's where I come down on this and here's why?
So I can kick it off. One of the most disappointing things that I've seen happened at Columbia just it's about a week ago on Sunday, where some students invited speakers who actually are based in Canada and participated by Zoom. It turned into what really seems like, if you watch some of the videos, a Hamas recruiting event. And I'm just going to offer one quote, perhaps the most shocking to me, and the quote was, "There's nothing wrong with being a fighter in Hamas." Really? Really? Do you read the newspapers? And let's not forget that Hamas is a designated terrorist organization in the US and in the European Union. But let me explain what actually happened, because it's important that you know. So a group of students wanted to do this. They approached Columbia University. Columbia University said absolutely not, no. So if one parent says no, you go to the next. They went to Barnard. And they said, we'd like to do this. And they actually, I think, temporarily found a Barnard faculty member who hadn't really looked into it, who said, oh, okay, sure, you can do this through my center. And then other people approached that faculty member and explained what this really was, and Barnard withdrew its approval. So let me be clear, this event was not permitted. What they did is the students went to a dorm, and they took over a space in the dorm, and they held an unauthorized event in the dorm. And this, unfortunately, gives the impression that either Columbia or Barnard or both had somehow approved this, and quite the opposite was true. But for those of you who are interested, Manoush Shafiq, our president, issued a statement on Friday referencing this indicating how shocked she was, indicating that a number of people had been suspended indefinitely, and just concluding with what I thought was a wonderful phrase. She said, "I never thought that as a university president I'd have to say this, but you cannot support violence or terrorism at Columbia," right? So in any event, this is an outlier case, but it should not have happened. And it just breaks my heart that there were some students who seemed to think that this was a good idea.
Kind of cannot decide what case to choose. And honestly, partly it's because I'm so deeply involved in some of them that I think it might be unfair to air them in a public forum, given that they were not, that what I can the cases that I have in mind do not have a conclusion that's clean and final in the same way that you do. And partly it's because our president stepped down, we have interim leadership, and I think a lot of people are still unsure about next steps in all of this domain. I will mention one thing not from Penn's campus, with apologies, even though that wasn't exactly the question. A couple of weeks ago, I participated in an exchange on the pages of the Democracy Journal with my colleague Erwin Chemerinsky, who is the dean of the Berkeley Law School, and he's Jewish, which is relevant to the story, in case you don't know. And he recently invited the graduating seniors from the law school to dinner at his house. And a group of students posted a caricature of him holding two knives and looking quite ridiculous in a Jewish caricature way. I don't know exactly how to portray that. And saying that whoever goes to the dean's house endorses genocide because the dean supports genocide. And so in the exchange that we had in writing about the boundaries of open expression, especially in regards to anti-Semitism on college campuses, Erwin, who is a lawyer, obviously, and a strong free speech advocate, indicated that he sees the First Amendment as the main boundary that he draws. And of course, a caricature like this would be protected in the US by the First Amendment. The line that I drew in that exchange was a line of inclusion and dignitary safety. And so my sense is that this kind of publication or posting of posters all around the school of this caricature of the dean with the received comments about him should in fact be punished, in my view, because not just because it hurts the dean's feeling, which it did, but because of the Jewish students who are seeing these posters all around the school, and the posters going with no response. Maybe it's not him who should have responded, maybe it's the chancellor or the university in some other way, or another entity, but I think leaving this without a response is a mistake.
Thank you. And I didn't intend to restrict you to your own campus, so sorry if I implied that. I mean, part of what's so valuable and impactful about both of your work is that you're doing this work on major campuses, but it has, people are reading your report, people are reading your book, you have collegial interaction, so what you're doing has effects far beyond your campuses.
I do think some people are waiting for the movie version of my report.
All right, so since it's getting late, I'm just going to choose one more question, even though there are so many great ones. So we talked about what I'm happy to hear is really, in your view, a minority of faculty, but folks who are educated holding such objectionable views on violent terrorists. And I was speaking over dinner, looking for Alan, there you are, on members of Congress who are privy to all kinds of briefings and should know about Hamas, should know more than their statements seem to imply. On the other side, we have students who don't, who it's not their thing. I was speaking to a colleague, a rabbinic colleague, whose daughter, her big issue is climate. She doesn't read about Israel, but her progressive friends, like there's a certain vibe, as you said, kind of progressive politics dictate that, that there's a genocide in Palestine that we need to oppose. And it often doesn't come from a place of hatred. In fact, it comes from kind of good impulses to support the oppressed and make the world a better place. You can't reach all of those students, you as faculty or your colleagues in the classroom. I don't know if you have ideas about sort of the prescription, what to do about just that pervasive vibe and assumption among the uneducated.
So again, I would say, even though the ranks of people participating in some of these events have definitely grown over the fall and they still ebb and flow, I think this is still not the mainstream of young people today generally, or even left-leaning young people more specifically. I think we need to make an effort to clarify the need for nuance in the process of solving or getting to a slightly less horrible place in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think the notion that if you want to be pro-Palestinian, you have to be anti-Israel is a misguided notion that no one in Israel, or outside a very thin minority, most people either on the Jewish Israeli or the Israeli more broadly or the Palestinian side would endorse. There is no problem to be pro-Israel and pro-peace and pro-Palestinian. These ideas have to resonate more broadly, and it's going to be our job as educators, as Jews, as expats, to do that, because really the polarization around this issue is not serving well American democracy, it's not serving well our efforts on college campuses, and it's most definitely not serving well anyone on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean.
So I just want to observe that Segal feels strongly, but you haven't heard her yell. I feel strongly. I don't think you've heard me yell. And one of the things that makes me sad about some of what we see on campus is just how bad the advocacy is, right? And so the truth is, if you want to move people, the outrageous statements are unhelpful, counterproductive, right? So there's room for education in training people, one, how to think about issues in a more sophisticated way, and that has to do with facts. Sorry. There, I feel strongly. It has to do with facts, it has to do with analysis, and that's what great universities like the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, JTS, like that's what we're supposed to do. And at the same time, if we can also help people to use the facts and to use the analysis in a way that is compelling to people who don't already agree with you. That's a pretty good idea as well. And I'm just reminded of what my old boss, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, used to say. She said, you can disagree without being disagreeable. And her point wasn't only, although she meant it, it wasn't only that that was the right thing to do, it was also the persuasive thing to do.
Thank you so much, both of you. I think I speak for everyone in saying that this was really a privilege tonight to hear your thoughts, to hear about your work. Before you start talking and leaving, I want to take the liberty of charging everyone on your way home tonight to think about something concrete from what our experts tonight shared that you can apply in some way, either in an action or orientation or donation or something that you can apply around these issues that are so consequential, which is why we're all here. So just a final reminder that you can pick up a complimentary copy of David's book in the auditorium just outside. Some of them are signed, and if you get an unsigned one, David's happy to sign it. I want to thank Tom Cashin, our Director of Public Events, for doing an enormous amount of work to bring everything this evening together. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again soon. Have a good night.